Thank you, Dr. Neusel, for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. As Melanie said, I see myself as an effective altruist. Two concepts here, altruism and effectiveness, and I'll shortly delve into what they mean. And I do think that if we reason more systematically about how we can effectively make the world a better place and what's actually at stake, also in terms of our individual choices, then one striking and interesting, probably very surprising result is that it's actually within the capacity of all of us, of each one of us, to literally save 1 million lives. And I'll try to back up this maybe startling claim. So yeah, as I said, two concepts, altruism and effectiveness. Altruism is basically the opposite of pure egoism, of pure selfishness. So it's about helping others and trying to reduce the amount of involuntary suffering in the world. The other element here is effectiveness. And this element has a normative component. It basically says that we should also pay attention to the numbers. So we shouldn't just try to save any number of others, but we should try and aim for the greatest possible number of other individuals. And we should do so in an empirically, scientifically informed and strategic way. Now that might sound trivial, but it's actually surprisingly hard to do because a lot of activism is also emotionally driven. And that's not bad per se, of course. I mean, if we weren't deep down driven by compassion, then we probably wouldn't be here. I mean, we wouldn't care about trying to make the world a better place and reducing suffering. So an emotional grounding is absolutely essential. But I like to distinguish between deep emotion and more superficial emotion. So I'm all in favor of deep emotion, but then when it comes to superficial emotion and gut feelings, these can often be very wrong, as the history of moral progress shows too. I mean, so many superficial emotions were sort of stumbling blocks on the way of moral progress. I mean, all sorts of discriminations, homophobia, sexism, racism, all sorts of evils, warfare, all of that stuff was backed at various points in history by superficial emotions, by our gut feelings. But I do think that sort of the countermeasure is a combination of deep compassion and then systematic reason. And that's basically what effective altruism is all about. Deep compassion in combination with our best, most systematic, scientifically grounded reason. Now, why do the numbers count and why is it important to help? I'm a philosopher by training and we like to use thought experiments, of course. Now imagine you're a firefighter faced with that kind of situation. You're faced with a tragic moral dilemma with two burning buildings and you receive the information that the big building currently contains 100 individuals that are suffering and will die if you don't save them, and the small building contains one person. And you also have the information that it's unfortunately no longer possible to save all of these individuals involved, and you have to make a tough choice. Is it the 100 or the one? Of course, there's always, needless to say, always a third option. Just go grab a beer. That's the non-altruistic, the selfish option. And of course, as we all can see, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty psychopathic choice when faced with a catastrophe. Of course, the next step will then be to argue that the world each and every day as we face it, although we may not emotionally feel it, is actually a catastrophe. Now, option 3 is basically out. That's not an option. Non-altruism is not an option when faced with catastrophe. And it seems like, yeah, I mean, it's a tragedy, so some people would argue, no, I mean, it's just so tragic to tell the one, hey, so sorry, we're just one, we're going to save the 100. But, I mean, what's the alternative? The alternative is that 100 individuals will die. And that seems like the bigger evil in this case. So, in this case, if we're faced with a moral dilemma, the best we can do is go for the lesser evil. And that means trying to save the 100 here. Now, some people might object, isn't that a sort of mathematics with lives, you know, doesn't that run counter to morality? And I don't think that's true at all. I do think the numbers are important, and especially so in morality. Numbers count because individuals count. Numbers aren't abstract entities in this context, because each and every number represents an individual life. And so it's extremely appropriate to take the numbers into account if all lives count equally, I think. And then there's also very intuitive arguments from current political context and everyday context. I mean, suppose the numbers didn't count, then it seems like we couldn't be making reasonable choices about healthcare systems, say. So if you can choose between two healthcare systems, and the empirical data shows that one healthcare system will lead to more victims of diseases than the other one, then, I mean, the moral and also political choice is pretty clear. But if the numbers don't count, then how could we back up such judgments? Same with traffic laws. So if you can choose between two traffic laws and you know that one of these will minimize the number of victims, will save a greater number of lives, then, of course, the moral thing to do is to go for that particular law. Last but not least, there's also golden rule reasoning backing this sort of thing up. So if you were among the potential victims, say, I'm going back to the burning house thought experiment. If you were one of these 101 potential victims, then you would like to see a policy in place that says that the greatest number should be saved, because that means that your own probability, I mean, your probability is far greater to be among the 100, that your probability will be highest to be saved. So there's a lot of moral arguments, philosophical arguments, backing up this crucial claim, I believe, that the numbers should count in morality as well. Now, the next step, of course, is to ask, well, where are the burning buildings out there in the real world? And which ones are how big in terms of their size? That's very crucial. I mean, if the numbers count, if we should aim for the biggest numbers, then we need to know what the biggest burning buildings are out there. Now, the global movement of effective altruism has several focus areas, and one standard focus area is global poverty. And global poverty in the context of effective altruism is often prioritized over domestic politics. And of course, these are the usual priorities of basically all the parties, left or right-wing or centrist, domestic politics. But if you think about it, so if each and every life counts for the same, and if it is the case that up to 1 billion people are still suffering from extreme poverty, living on less than $2 per day per capita, that's purchasing power parity, and as a consequence, more than 20,000 children still die each and every day. I mean, if that were happening in our home country, it would be a total no-brainer that this should be prioritized. But now, why would it matter that the geographical distance is bigger? So, from that point of view, it makes a lot of sense to prioritize these global issues. What makes a whole lot of sense too, needless to say, is to prioritize the reduction of animal suffering. Why? I mean, as the philosophical literature has shown, and Peter Singer has pioneered this work, needless to say, there's really no rational grounds for speciesism, for species discrimination. I mean, all the traditional arguments have failed. I mean, clearly we can't discriminate animals based on looks, the phenotype, or genes, or based on their supposedly lower intelligence. I mean, that would be grounds for discrimination among humans too. So all of these arguments have failed. And then empirically it's the case that we're dealing with vast numbers and with extremely intense suffering. So it makes sense to prioritize animal issues. But now we need to zoom in further and further apply the systematic arguments. What are the biggest burning buildings within the animal cause? And here it makes sense to just consult rough statistics. How many animals are there of what groups? And how do they compare? So animals in research labs, 10 to the power of 8, that's about 100 million. How does that compare with livestock? Livestock is on the order of 10 to the power of 10. So that's 10 billion in terms of the order of magnitude. Then when you compare that with wild animals, there's actually about 1,000 times more wild animals, or even more than that, than farm animals, interestingly. And many, many times more if we consider invertebrates, particularly insects too. So that gives us a rough idea of the scale, the scales that we're talking about here. Now, if we buy the initial argument about why it's important to consider the numbers, then of course that's a strong argument for focusing our activist efforts on the biggest burning buildings too. And historically, unfortunately, that hasn't really been the case. I mean, historically, the animal welfare movement has often focused on lab animals, for instance. And I do believe that's because we tend to feel sort of a lot of outrage when we see direct animals, direct violence that's perpetrated by humans against animals. So that makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. we experience sort of direct outrage at that. But when the suffering is sort of more abstract, more systematic, or then even natural, then maybe we do experience sadness, but the outrage isn't as immediate. And so I think that's a case where the emotions get in the way of a proper rational prioritization. Now, we see the same phenomenon when we analyze, for instance, the current allocation of donations. So where are pro-animal donations currently going? These are figures from the US. So on the left-hand side, you can see the number of animals used. Of course, they tend to suffer a lot and to eventually get killed. And as you can see, the vast majority of the animals that we use are farm animals, the vast majority. But then in terms of the amount of donations, where are they going? Well, you know, the majority of donations are currently going to shelters and then to other things, and only a small minority of current donations are going to farm animal activism. And that seems very hard to justify if we buy the argument that the numbers count and that we should focus on the biggest problems. Now, if we zoom in further at this point, what should we focus on, or are there further recommendations to be drawn from this within the factory farming cause area? Now, one question to ask here is, what foods cause the greatest amount of suffering per calorie? And that crucial question reminded me of the old joke about why vegans don't eat chickens. I suppose you all know that, right? Why don't vegans eat chickens?
No.
No?
Why is that?
Why?
Why? Because they contain eggs. I mean, it's obvious, right? And the answer actually isn't terrible, because it turns out that eggs are actually worse than beef or pork. So if you look at the statistics, you can just focus on the column about lives per 1,000 calories. So chicken is actually the worst product by far, followed by eggs, interestingly, and then pork, beef, cheese, and milk. And actually the difference between lacto-vegetarianism and veganism is almost zero, but the difference to ovo-vegetarianism can be huge. And that's very interesting to know when we're doing farm animal advocacy. That's, I think, data that we should take into account. It's interesting, for instance, that calculations show that vegetarian sausages, if they contain eggs, can be worse in terms of the animal suffering and the number of deaths that they cause than actual meat-based sausages. So I think that's something to know. Also in terms of the recommendations that we give out, I mean, sort of the classic way, going from meat eating to vegetarianism to veganism, may be quite flawed in the light of this data. So maybe the first things that we should recommend is cutting out chicken and eggs. That's also crucial, I believe, because there may be some tension, some rather deep tension between focusing on ecological arguments and on animal rights or animal welfare arguments at times. So there has been a shift in the general population from the consumption of beef to the consumption of chicken, for health reasons, but also for ecological reasons. Now, animal welfare and animal rights-wise, that's a tragedy. It's a huge catastrophe. In my home country, in Switzerland, the situation is such that over the last 10 years, meat consumption has remained roughly constant at about 50 kilograms per person per year. So roughly constant meat consumption, but the number of animals slaughtered per year, so the deaths that we are causing, that number has exploded. Why? There has been a shift, a mere 3 kilogram shift from beef to chicken. So over the last 10 years, people per capita have eaten 3 kilograms less chicken and have less beef, and have replaced that by chicken. And that has led to an explosion of the deaths that we're causing. So it went up from, in Switzerland, it's a country of 8 million, it went up from 40 million to 60 million, despite meat consumption staying constant. So that's an extreme moral tragedy, of course, and it's just due to this shift from beef to chicken. Now, if we take these calculations a bit further and ask, okay, how many animals can we roughly expect to save as vegan consumers? It's about 1,000, as a rough estimate. About 1,000 animals per lifetime are typically consumed by typical meat eaters. Now, it's immediately clear from an effectiveness point of view that I mean, of course, it's extremely important, morally speaking, to avoid all of this suffering and all of these deaths. But at the end of the day, we can always only make decisions as one person for one person. So it's immediately clear that if we can influence others to make the same choices, this can be much more impactful. So we need to go one level meta and try and replicate our behavior. So creating vegans is far more impactful than being vegan ourselves. And as you can see, so this 1 million figure that I included in the subtitle of the talk is within reach. I mean, if you manage to create 1,000 lifetime vegans in your activist career, then you can expect to have saved 1 million animals. Now, it's probably hard, with one-on-one persuasion to achieve that, but maybe there's other things in which this could be done. So for instance, we could increase the amount of money that we donate towards effective outreach efforts, many of which Peter has pioneered, of course. And then it's also interesting to ask, okay, for a 1,000 donation, for a donation of $1,000, for instance, how many lives could we expect to save if we donate it to the most effective interventions? In order to answer this question, an organization has been set up within the context of the effective altruism movement called ACE, which stands for Animal Charity Evaluators. So they are sifting through the most recent studies about how many vegetarians or vegan adopters we can expect to create with various measures, say college leafleting or undercover investigations and so on and so forth. And of course the uncertainty there is great, but that doesn't mean that it's complete. So even if there's great uncertainty because the world is a complex mess, needless to say, we can still make rough ballpark estimates. And these are very crucial if we want to select the most effective activist strategies. So animal charity evaluators currently conclude that if we donate $1,000 to typical animal shelters, we can expect to save between 2 and 3 animals. But if we donate the same amount of money to effective organizations that particularly tackle the problem of farm animal suffering, we can expect to spare many, many more animals, up to or more than 10,000 animals per $1,000 donated. So pretty crazy figures. But yeah, I mean, you can imagine how that could go. So with $1,000, you can maybe print 10,000 or maybe even 100,000 leaflets. These can then be distributed to college students and so forth. And yeah, you just need to create the equivalent of maybe 10 new vegetarian or vegan adopters in order to achieve this amazing result. But now wait, I mean, that's pretty crazy, right? I mean, these are huge moral stakes. So if $1,000 can save more than 10,000 animals, I mean, that's crazy. That's 10 times more than our own lifetime impact can be as vegans. And it seems that most people in rich countries, most animal activists, could easily afford to donate $1,000 per year or more. But that's an amount that's much higher than is currently typically the case. And so I think, yeah, we need to ask this question. Why is it currently the case that we typically only, or people typically only donate something like, I mean, at least in the German-speaking world, of course, donation cultures vary quite a bit by country, but at least in the German-speaking world, the typical membership fees and annual donations are at about $100 per year to an animal welfare rights organization. Now, if we compare the following, let's say we trust these numbers, and even if these numbers were off by 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, the result wouldn't change by much. But if we go by these numbers from animal charity evaluators, then we can compare the following. So if we don't donate $1,000 that we could easily donate because we don't really need the money in order to live our lives in a comfortable way, if we don't donate this amount of money, then 10,000 animals will suffer and die. That will be a consequence of our choice. Now, if we compare that with 2 eating, let's say, 100 grams of beef, which is less than 1 in 1,000 in terms of the fraction of a cow, so we could do that more than 1,000 times, and only then would we have sort of killed statistically 1 cow, then what do we feel bad about and what are we neutral about in terms of our emotions? And does that make rational sense? So as I said, I do think that compassion is supremely important as the basis of it all. But then there's like more superficial and specific emotions that do get in the way of rational evaluations of what's effective. Effective in order to apply compassion to the real world and save as many lives as possible, and what isn't. So it seems there's a huge disconnect here in terms of our emotional responses. I mean, most vegetarians or vegans would feel extremely bad about eating 100 grams of beef, say, but wouldn't feel that bad at all, if at all, about not donating $1,000 that they could maybe easily donate upon reflection. And I do think there's a strong philosophical rational case that we should attempt to change that at least a bit. And maybe we shouldn't just focus on the horror on our plates, but also on the horror in our wallet, which isn't given by the fact that our wallets are empty, but that they are so full, at least if we're living in rich countries. And it's also important to realize that our wallets are also full if we ourselves are rather, relatively speaking, poor, because through advocacy we can try and move other people's money as well. So what I would propose is that we try and prioritize establishing a donation norm to a greater extent also, and not just a food norm. So the food norm has been pushed very systematically, and that's an awesome thing. And needless to say, PETA has been doing pioneering work on that front too. So it's crucial that we continue pushing the food norm. And how do we do it? Well, extremely systematically. We produce materials, leaflets, books, videos, and so on. We send out starter kits. We give people practical tricks and tips about how to handle transitions and about how to stick to new habits. And all of that is great, and it's absolutely necessary in practice. But I think we should be doing the same when it comes to donation and when it comes to money. And that's what the effective altruism movement has been pioneering. It's been encouraging people to consider donating 10% or more of what they earn to charity. I mean, when I first heard about that idea, donating 10% or more of my income, I thought, wow, that's a rather high amount, not sure I can do that. But then when you read about happiness psychology and so on, you realize that it's extremely unlikely that this would make one unhappy. If you earn like a typical median salary in a rich country, then most people could easily afford giving 10% or more. So I do think we should try and argue systematically that donating a lot of money is just as important as being vegan, actually. And maybe we can get, if organizations like PETA or like the WEBU can successfully get people to change their diets. I do think, as vegans and, we sometimes also rationalize, or, we tend to think that the choice is so easy, and, maybe if you have like a good environment and so on, it is easy, but vegan recidivism is also, quite high. So unfortunately, many people go back, they go vegetarian or vegan after a few years, they go back again, and they do cite social reasons, also maybe misguided health reasons. In any case, in the current societal environment, it's not really an easy thing to do. But if you think about it, if we can still get people, at least for some years and some like for a lifetime, if we can get people to change their diet for this important cause 3 times a day, then shouldn't it be rather easy if we try to do that systematically to also get them to donate $200 instead of just $100? Maybe that's the much easier change, actually, or maybe even 1,000. Who knows what's possible? When veganism wasn't a thing yet, many people, including myself, I'd have thought, oh, that's a really big thing, we can never do that. But hey, sometimes it's surprisingly easy, especially if you do outreach among young people, how easily people can pick up new habits, when they think about them with fresh eyes. And something similar might be true with regard to a donation norm. So I do think it's really worthwhile trying. And effective altruism has also developed a more radical notion in that context, namely the concept of earning to give. And that's sort of young professionals choosing the careers as professional donors as opposed to direct worker and direct activists. And these people often make more than 100K per year or even much more, and then donate 50% or more of what they earn. So they try and get rich, not with the aim of then being rich, but with the aim of giving as much money away as possible. In the German-speaking world, there's also been, that's a friend of mine, he studied physics, so especially for people with quantitative backgrounds, mathematics, physics, software engineering, whatever, careers in the private sector can be very lucrative. Especially in Switzerland also, that's something we've been encouraging people to do. Going to Switzerland, high school teachers, can earn more than $100,000 per year. Doctors earn more than $200,000 a year in Switzerland. So Switzerland is a good place in order to do earning to give. And it's a cool concept because So this is my friend Adrian here. Originally, he also considered becoming an activist, but then he figured, in order for activism to really be effective, many activists need to be paid basic incomes, such that they can focus on their activism with 100% of their time and energy. And I think that's also a big stumbling block for any social movement. Like, I mean, politically also, you know, many would advocate for a view that political work should be based on volunteer work and so on. But why actually? You know, in the private sector, nobody would rely on volunteering, and for a good reason. You need to be effective there, or you'll die in the market. And the same is true. I mean, burnout risk is high and stuff, and I do think that comes. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so Melanie could tell you much more about that. But in part, I do believe it comes from the lack of funding for basic incomes for activists, and that's something effective altruism is trying to change. So Adrian is now making more than $200,000 per year, and he can pay for up to 10 full-time activists. And so that's also a meta strategy with which you can sort of try and multiply your impact. Okay, let's take this a little further in terms of the burning buildings out there. We've considered farmed animals and meta strategies. Now here, a big building that I already mentioned is wild animals. There are at least 1,000 times more wild animals. If we also count insects, and it's many orders of magnitude more wild animals than there are farm animals. Now, why should they be so ethically relevant? I mean, aren't they basically, I mean, to the extent that we haven't interfered with them, aren't they basically living free and great lives in nature? Well, I think that conclusion would be too hasty, as recent research has shown. I mean, that's also been sort of a paradigm shift for myself. I mean, previously I was sort of more on the side of saying, yeah, the main goal should be, as Tom Reagan once put it, to leave animals alone, you know, leave them alone. That sort of should be the supreme goal. Now I'm no longer sure about that, having considered the situation of most wild animal individuals. So actually, the empirical data, and that's due to evolutionary population dynamics mainly, shows that a typical life in the wild goes something like the following. Birth, then struggle over the way too scarce resources against the way too numerous siblings, and last but not least, a very horrible death, usually very shortly after birth already. Now, unfortunately, that's not a caricature, but that seems to be pretty true. Now, the short explanation of this tragedy is that most wild species bet on the numbers as a reproductive strategy. They are so-called R selectors. So they try and maximize the number of offspring that they have. They don't really provide good parental care because they just bet on some of the individuals surviving. So sea turtles are unfortunately a very typical species. So most species, particularly fish, but most species in general, follow this precise strategy. And if you think about it, so per turtle mother, there will be hundreds or even thousands of kids. But now, if each ecological niche is necessarily finite, so at some point, the population must stay roughly constant because the ecological carrying capacity is finite. So when this point is reached, you can figure that most of these animal kids will die very shortly after birth and won't make it to adulthood. So if the population stays roughly constant, then only 2 kids can survive per turtle mother. But there are hundreds or even thousands of them. And so what happens to them? Well, they have to compete over way too scarce resources. There are way too many of them. And then they either starve to death or suffer from illnesses and die, or they get eaten, often alive. So that's actually, unfortunately, what happens to 99% of all free-living wild animals. And I've recently been surprised to see on the PETA website that there was an article critically discussing predator reintroduction. Also saying, among other things, so there were many points that were made there, some ecological, some animal rights related, that reintroducing predators can lead to huge disruptions and suffering, of course, in prey populations too. And I think PETA is right, and I'm grateful for that fact that this issue is now also being discussed more. Of course, it's a very complex issue and a very sensitive one. And the philosophical work that's been done on it so far is still also in its infancy and it's still quite shallow. So I myself I'm only starting to think more deeply from a philosophical point of view about this topic, but I do think it's a topic that the animal rights movement will have to explore certainly in the future, but I think it can't hurt if we start doing so now to an extent. So when talking about wild animal suffering, it's, you know, I mean, I had this rosy view of nature too, basically, and yeah, I mean, we all know about the standard wild animal documentaries, and yes, of course, we know about predation, and it's a gruesome thing. But when you analyze how wild animal documentaries usually work, I mean, they glorify, of course, you know, the dynamics of it all, and then, yeah, you have this scene where the prey is being hunted down, but then, you know, it goes directly to the scene where the prey is then consumed, and what you don't see is what happens in between, which is often at least minutes, but more typically hours of extremely intense suffering. So literal torture experiences going on. So that's like a baby gazelle here, and apes. And yeah, so if you go on YouTube and type in something like wild animal suffering, natural Darwinism, so I mean, we all know about that sort of abstractly, but it's still, yeah. I mean, the footage, I mean, I basically couldn't watch it. To me, it had a more traumatic effect than watching, a much more traumatic effect than watching slaughter videos. So we should be careful with it, but I do think it's important to also think about these facts from time to time. Now, just philosophically speaking, as I said, I'm very uncertain about how to ultimately answer these questions, but I do think there's hard work to be done for the animal rights movement here. So one might just object, well, but you know, it's all natural, and if it's all natural, then it's all good. But okay, think about how anti-speciesism would react to human babies being preyed upon. Would they say it's all natural, therefore it doesn't matter? Or what, just hypothetically, say factory farms grew naturally out of the ground and it wasn't they weren't actively exploitative on our part. Well, we would probably still say, well, it's still bad, we should still try and close them down. So I don't think it's just about exploitation. Yes, it is about exploitation, because exploitation causes suffering, but a lot of suffering is also natural. If I'm suffering, and it's bad, then I don't really care whether I'm being exploited, I just want the suffering to stop. Then predators experience existential necessity. Yes, that's true, and it's extremely important, but again, applied to the human case. Say I need a kidney, and there are no donors, am I then justified in killing someone in order to get a kidney for myself because I experience existential necessity? Maybe not. Last but not least, non-human predators don't know what they're doing, so they are not, technically speaking, moral agents. We can't hold them morally or legally responsible. Yes, a very important point. There's a counter consideration though. Well, you know, some human predators don't know either, you know, are classified as insane or something. But we still try and make sure that they are not being violent towards others. So the issue is very tricky, and I do think because wild animal suffering is also vast, yeah, the animal rights movement should start and explore it more. Last but not least, well, you know, what could we do in terms of technological fixes if we go maybe far into the future? Well, you know, maybe we can envision a future where we would feed predators in vitro meat, but not just non-human predators, also human predators. That's what we as a think tank, Sentience Politics, have been looking into. Potential technological fixes might be more effective even than moral advocacy. And as activists, we also might have a bias towards moral advocacy because we feel like, yeah, you know, we need to convey this important moral point. But we should be open-minded about that. Maybe technological fixes are more effective, particularly also because behavior, so if you can fix behaviors with technology, then maybe the new behaviors can fix moral attitudes also. So a main reason why people still don't accept the anti-speciesist paradigm is because they realize, hey, if I accept anti-speciesism, I'll have to change my diet. And people don't want to do that, of course. And yeah, you know, in a sense, everyone's a vegan between meals or deep in their hearts. I do think, you know, if you're against animal cruelty essentially and recognize that animals can suffer, then you should, at least in principle, agree that veganism is great and that we should probably introduce animal rights. But there's this stumbling block of food, and maybe in vitro meat will be instrumental in fixing this problem. Yeah, we are in contact with researchers such as Mark Post, one of the leaders in terms of developing in vitro meat. He expects it to be economically viable and feasible, to become feasible over the next decades. And of course it could be, there's no guarantee, but it could be disruptive to the meat industry. And yeah, some of our people discussing these proposals with Mark. Yeah, as Melanie said, I'm the co-founder and president of an organization called Sentience Politics. We're trying to do politics for all sentient beings. We consider ourselves an anti-speciesist think tank, and we're currently working on policy papers and political initiatives growing out of Switzerland, where we'll have binding votes, binding democratic votes on the introduction of vegan food in public canteens, binding votes on the introduction of basic rights for all primates and more. And now we're expanding to Austria, Germany, and also to the UK, and are trying to evaluate what sort of political niches and opportunities there are in these countries for anti-speciesist activism. So we're working on policy papers on all of these topics, promotion of vegan food, basic rights, funding for in vitro meat, alternatives to animal testing, wild animal suffering, also potential insect suffering, also a very important topic. Last but not least, we're organizing a conference for effective animal activism called the Sentience Conference. It's upcoming at the end of May, May 21st and 22nd at the Technical University of Berlin. We still have, so currently I think 230 people or something have registered. We still have about 100 spots left. So feel free to apply. Some notable speakers include Nick Cooney from Mercy for Animals, John Bockman, the head of Animal Charity Evaluators, Melanie Joy, Ria Rebeck from Animal Equality, Mahi Klosterhalfen from Albert Schweitzer Stiftung, and Sebastian Joy, and many more. So basically a gathering of all important organizations in the space of effective animal activism. Now, why are we doing all of that? Well, because we recognize that we are fighter fires constantly faced with that situation, and we don't want to prioritize drinking beer all the time, but we need to drink beer sometimes in order not to burn out. And that's why I'm looking forward to having a beer with all of you after this event. Thank you so much for your attention.